All right, welcome back to our Gatty lecture series. Today we have Ivan Small, who's actually a Cornell alum with us, and we'll have Salmai from the history department, a PhD student from the history department, to introduce him.
Hello, everyone. Ivan Small is a professor of anthropology and the director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at the Northern Illinois University. He is author of Currencies of Imagination, Channeling Money and Chasing Mobility in Vietnam, and the co-editor of Money at the Margins, Global Perspectives on Technology, Financial Inclusion, and Design. He has written numerous peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, op-eds, and other publications examining connections between financial, bodily, and material mobilities in and between Southeast Asia and the United States. He has recently held senior visiting research fellow positions at Fulbright University, Vietnam, and the Yusuf Ishak Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore. He holds a PhD in anthropology and Southeast Asian Studies from Cornell University and a master's in international affairs from Columbia. So please welcome Ivan.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be back here at Cornell and the Kahin Center and Ithaca, and to see lots of snow outside. So thank you everybody for coming out on this snowy day. It feels like a bit of a homecoming for me. The title of my talk today is Worlding Ethno-burbs, 50 Years of Southeast Asian American Displacemaking. And in this talk, I'm going to share some of the recent work that I've been doing on transnational Southeast Asian migration, as well as subsequent Asian American community formations. And I'll be focusing on movements domestically between the Midwest, the Northeast, the California, and the South, with a focus on Vietnamese Americans in particular. My analysis draws on ethnography, oral histories, archives, and diasporic cultural productions. Most of the images in this presentation today are from former refugee camp archives, or shared with me in the process of conducting oral histories, or taken by myself during fieldwork for this project. So in the first part of the talk, I'm going to discuss resettlement processes for Southeast Asian refugees after 1975, and how such policies were resisted and circumvented through secondary migration. In the second half of the talk, I will ethnographically dwell on the connective affordances of the automobile in particular as an important tool that can help us to understand how some of these processes have unfolded. Okay, so let's begin. As this audience at the Southeast Asia program is well familiar, Southeast Asians, including Vietnamese, Cambodian, Lao, and Hmong, were originally resettled in the United States, mostly as refugees after the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, facilitated by the Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act. At the time, refugees from South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were intentionally scattered through 50 states as part of a dispersion policy intended to assimilate newcomers to American society. In a letter to Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld at the time, one analyst likened the approach to scattering individual refugees like sand through the entire nation. There were many drawbacks to this national dispersion policy, as resettled refugees, who were already traumatized from war and forced exodus, attempted to navigate atomized lives in new environments with limited transportation and housing options and unfamiliar climates. They did this, furthermore, without strong ethnic or social support networks to fall back upon. Now, it's worth noting that this dispersion model that was applied, while in many ways misinformed, was not necessarily new. It was applied with parallel logic, for example, after World War II, in the resettlement of formerly interned Japanese Americans, who were encouraged at the time to not return to the West Coast, from which they were mostly removed in 1942. And yesterday, in fact, is the 83rd anniversary of Executive Order 9066 that mandated Japanese American internment. So the executive orders that we see coming out of Washington these days are not necessarily a new thing. Upon release 2 to 3 years later, Japanese Americans were expected to, quote, amalgamate, in one planner's words, to primarily Caucasian communities in other parts of the country. As President Franklin Roosevelt remarked in 1944, he wanted to avoid what he called social discombobulation in resettling the Japanese American population. Scattering 75,000 Japanese all around the United States, in Roosevelt's words, was not going to upset anyone. So this dispersion rationale was revived in 1975 when dealing with Vietnamese, Cambodian, Lao, and Hmong refugees from Indochina. As one planner at the time noted, the mistake in the 1960s had been to forget the perceived structural benefits of assimilation. In the 1970s, there was a determination to, quote, not create another Miami, unquote, referring to the concentrated resettlement of Cuban refugees there after Castro's rise to power in 1959. And yet, even after the Ford administration created incentives for states, local governments, and voluntary agencies to facilitate refugee sponsorship, the reception of Southeast Asians by war-weary Americans was rather lukewarm. One Catholic cleric advocating for Southeast Asian refugee reception pled that, quote, these were beautiful people who would be resettled in beautiful ways. In other words, quietly and spread out in such a way that Americans would not notice or complain. Some of the initial resettlement cities for Southeast Asians included places like Des Moines, Iowa, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Utica, New York, Dorchester and Springfield, Massachusetts, where this picture is from, and Hartford, Connecticut, supported by agencies such as Catholic Charities. Now, as you can see in this Office of Refugee Resettlement document for Cambodian refugees in 1989, even at that time, there was a push for resettlement to mostly smaller and less diverse municipalities, such as Mobile, Alabama, and Lincoln, Nebraska. As you can imagine, some of these places were not the most conducive for establishing new lives in America. This is a picture of Seadrift, Texas, that I visited a couple years ago, where a number of Vietnamese settled as fishermen in the late 1970s, only to be attacked by the KKK, who resented them as encroaching on their ways of life. There's still a couple of Vietnamese restaurants in this small town, but many of the original refugee population have now moved away. In general, within a decade of the start of post-1975 refugee resettlement, many Southeast Asians in the US had left towns and states of original resettlement to move to warmer climates with significant Asian population centers. And this is a process that sociologists have called secondary migration. In particular, they chose California, as you can see from this map on the left, that tracks Vietnamese American resettlement. And here on the right is a picture of a shopping mall in Little Saigon, California, one of the first large resettlements that developed just south of Los Angeles. The automobile, which was oftentimes one of the first material purchases or acquisitions by refugee families, pictures of which circulate significantly in early remittance packages and letters sent by refugees who had arrived in America back to their homelands, contributed significantly to the secondary migration process. I will be focusing ethnographically on Southeast Asian American automobility during the second part of my talk, but first let's understand how it started and spread. In the archives of at least 3 of the 4 Southeast Asian refugee receiving camps in the United States, Camp Pendleton, California, Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, and Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, one finds significant evidence about the emphasis on teaching driving as a quintessential life skill for refugee future American survival and self-sufficiency. Here are some pictures of driving classes that took place in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, between May and December of 1975. Here's some more pictures as well. As Vietnamese, Lao, Cambodians, and Hmong were sponsored out of their camps, their first challenge was often learning to navigate complex and often limited public transportation systems in order to find their way to work and to school. As one Vietnamese former refugee shared, originally resettled in Springfield, Massachusetts, and now living in Southern California, Learning the bus map was one of the first tasks of American life. Eventually, many would learn to drive and pool money to buy a used car. Driving lessons continued to be extremely popular for new immigrants, in turn sponsored by earlier waves of refugees. One Vietnamese American woman who runs a driving school in Houston, Texas, says that she helps new Vietnamese in the area study and memorize for the written driving test as what she considers to be a service to her community. And here's a picture of a very common site in Houston, Texas, offering driving lessons so that you can get your license. Now, the automobile, in turn, opened up the possibility of resettlement in sprawling, suburban, car-centric landscapes that were often different from the small urban downtowns that many Southeast Asian Americans had first learned to navigate by bus. In this slide, you see the original Little Saigon, centered around Frank Zhao's construction of the Phu Klap Tha Mall in 1986, up here on the top, in Orange County, California. Little Saigon represents one of the most significant reconstitutions of Southeast Asian ethnic communities after the war, a sprawling suburban area of broad boulevards, shopping centers, and tract housing built on former agricultural and pasture land. It is now the largest Vietnamese community outside of Vietnam and has become the standard reference point for Southeast Asian American communities elsewhere. Little Saigon was first designated in 1988, bringing together parts of two separate cities, Westminster and Garden Grove, that had large Vietnamese populations. Its naming was a celebratory moment for many Vietnamese who had fought to establish their visibility in what was traditionally considered to be white farm and cattle ranch land, John Wayne country in the memories of many older Orange County residents. Little Saigon continues to be a spectrally aspirational model for many other emergent Vietnamese communities seeking recognition through naming. Indeed, there was a significant fallout in San Jose, California, here in 2008, when the politician Madison Nguyen, who represented a Vietnamese district, proposed to call the Story Road Vietnamese area the Saigon Business District instead of Little Saigon. And this was an attempt to avoid some of the diasporic anti-communist sentiment and baggage that was associated with its Southern California neighbor. But this simple change in naming met with a lot of resistance in the community and even a recall vote. Now, since the 2000s, a third wave of migration to southern Sunbelt metropoles has been in process. This has been fueled by new migration directly from Vietnam, as well as by many Asian Americans who feel priced out of the California housing market. So you may have noticed in the previous map that after California, Texas also has a significant Vietnamese population, now the second largest in the country. And yet much less has been written about Southeast Asian Americans in Texas or other states for that matter than in California, despite the processes having been driven by similar structural dimensions and personal motivations. In 2021, the Vietnamese American newspaper Người Viet reported that around 700,000 people have moved from Texas to California since 2010. Of these, many are third wave Asian American migrants that are intentionally choosing to settle in Asian ethno-burbs. Ethno-burbs is a term that the geographer Wei Li has used for suburbs outside of major urban centers, characterized by an influx of particular ethnic communities. In the Houston metro area, where the majority of Vietnamese now live in ethno-burbs rather than the city proper, the number of Vietnamese has gone from 9,000 in 1980 to 32,000 by 1990, and in 2020, 143,000. Many Vietnamese American residents talk about the familiarity of Houston's hot, humid environment, in some ways not dissimilar to Saigon, and how they have been able to purchase new houses and use the savings from the sale of their previous home in California as startup capital for new businesses such as restaurants or nail and hair salons. Third wave and new immigration communities, as opposed to first wave resettlers, are characterized by dispersed suburban transportation and real estate landscapes. The availability of cheaper and undeveloped land also affords more materially visible expressions of ethnic and cultural identities. This includes the kinds of large temples, churches, and shopping centers reflecting Asian architectural styles that are becoming more commonplace along thoroughfares such as the Buford Highway outside of Atlanta or Bel Air Boulevard outside of Houston. These developments are in many cases more materially visible than some of the older little Saigons in California where land is more expensive. Here, for example, is the recently opened Holy Vietnamese Martyrs Church in Norcross, Georgia. This was modeled after the 19th century Phat Siem Cathedral in North Vietnam, combining Western and Asian architectural styles. The construction of the cathedral was fundraised for years and strategically built right off the interstate highway in Norcross near Atlanta so that it would be visible by passerbys. The centrality of politics to community visibility remains widespread. This includes the politics of memory and loss. As new Little Saigons establish themselves, one sees parallel memorializations of Vietnamese refugee political and social pasts. These two monuments that remember veterans of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam and the refugee boat exodus, for example, are prominently displayed in a shopping plaza on Bel Air Boulevard in the heart of Houston's Little Saigon district. Here, ethno-mobile placemaking is directly related to memories of displacement, and I therefore use the term displacemaking to frame these activities and processes that have contributed to community formations. Memorials such as these, this is the same memorial in the background here, are sites of annual gatherings to commemorate Black April on April 30th. This is the anniversary of the day that Saigon fell, and is often considered to be Matnuk, the loss of country, or here on the banner, Kwokhan, a day of national shame. This photo was taken during a Houston gathering this past April. So in these processes of community building, a Saigon of half a century past and the little Saigons that have budded around the country, starting in California, are sources of mnemonic and aesthetic reference. The anthropologist Lisa Malki, interviewing Hutu refugees in Tanzania, noted how the plight of exiled refugees connected to histories of and obstacles to movement and agency contribute to what she terms mythico-collective histories and identity orientations. The irony for the Vietnamese American community, as Asian American studies scholar An Nguyen has noted, is that increasingly a significant segment of the Vietnamese diaspora is no longer directly or even indirectly connected to the former Saigon political regime. Nguyen estimates that in Houston alone, there are at least 10,000 recent immigrants from Vietnam who hail directly from the north, whose experiences of trans-Pacific mobility do not fit at all with a South Vietnamese refugee-centric displacement narrative. Vietnamese students from Vietnam have been rapidly increasing over the last decade. And when I used to teach at the University of Houston, I saw many families who are coming directly from Vietnam. I spent a sabbatical in Ho Chi Minh City, and I would often meet people that knew the University of Houston, and they said, "Oh, that's where all the rich Vietnamese go to school." And so, you know, it's a kind of different orientation, but often this story is lost in the general collective diaspora story. So the process of symbolically worlding little Saigons around a displaced refugee origin story becomes a point of mutual recognition or misrecognition, as the case may be. As the anthropologist Clifford Geertz argued long ago, culture revolves around the collective production and accepted recognition of shared community symbols that orient them to a shared system of meaning. These systems of meaning are cultivated and maintained in shared community spaces. So here's a picture of one of the Vietnamese community centers in the Asiatown neighborhood of Bel Air in Houston. And as you can see, the South Vietnamese flag of the Republic of Vietnam features prominently. And in other words, this is not the current flag of Vietnam. This, by the way, is where I work now at Northern Illinois University. We also have our own version of the Kahin Center. This is called the Pottinger House, where we gather, not as fancy as you guys, but very close to my heart. And this was one of our events that we had at the beginning of the semester. And here is the Vietnamese flag in the background. the red flag with the yellow star. But this is not the flag that you see flying around Vietnamese communities in Houston or anywhere else in the US for that matter. In the early 2000s, there was a concerted and coordinated effort to introduce legislation to Vietnamese communities around the country, from Seattle to New Orleans to Northern Virginia, that established the former Republican flag as the official heritage and freedom flag of Vietnamese in the United States. The ubiquity of the flag across Houston is reflective of that history of collective and sometimes coerced community organizing around a shared symbol of Vietnamese refugee identity. Bel Air reflects an in-between process of a longer durée out-migration from Houston's city center. And here is a picture of the original downtown Chinatown area where a lot of Vietnamese first came in the 1970s. But slowly people have been moving out towards the Midtown area. This was once a very thriving shopping mall called Mekong Center. And there's still a significant Vietnamese community here, but it's also increasingly in decline. But you see murals like this on some of the buildings. This is my favorite research assistant. Her name is Anna Small. She's my 5-year-old daughter, 3 years old at the time of this picture. Goes with me everywhere. But now the Vietnamese are increasingly moving even further out from the city to places like Sugar Land, Texas. And here you can see some significant Vietnamese temples that have been built. You can see the architecture there that really relies on the availability of land. And so it's partly driven by push and pull factors, the affordability of cheaper lands on the outskirts, but also the kind of gentrification of the city center. The original Chinatown in Houston is now right next to the Astro Stadium, and so that's really kind of changed the landscape there. Now, in other parts of the country, there are lots of different settlements as well, and some of these are asserting their longstanding presence. Boston has a significant community in Dorchester, and they held a naming ceremony for their Little Saigon business district just a couple of years ago in December 2021. Here's some pictures from that naming ceremony. A student researcher that I was working with there has documented the significant community efforts and divisive politics in recognizing and naming this space, which can reveal underlying tensions between newer and older Vietnamese, in which exclusion is sometimes as much a result as the kind of inclusiveness that such place namings are intended to demarcate. Whether one is included or excluded from local ethnic community politics, however, the infrastructural evidence of Vietnamese communities in places such as Dorchester or Hartford has been growingly apparent in the last decade. Part of what is enhancing the visibility of some of these communities is an influx of new money from Southeast Asia itself. Many Southeast Asian neighborhoods in the United States are characterized by significant remittance flows. And my first project, that was my dissertation at Cornell, and the subject of my first book was about kind of tracing some of those flows from Vietnamese communities in California to Vietnam and trying to understand the social impacts of that. But increasingly, these flows are bidirectional. There's money going from the US to Vietnam. There's also money flowing from Vietnam into the United States. And there's lots of ethnic remittance service providers that basically provide Hawala-style services, which create a bookkeeping techniques to kind of track these flows in both directions, but that actually don't require any transfer of money through a bank. And this facilitates Vietnamese in Vietnam to circumvent capital controls there. It also allows Vietnamese to kind of circumvent some of the regulatory hurdles of sending remittances that have been increasingly more difficult, going all the way back to 9/11, but also after the Dodd-Frank Act in 2013. And of course, now in 2025, there's even more uncertainty about these kinds of cross-border migration and financial flows. Some of these flows from Southeast Asia have been driven by EB-5 immigrant investor visas. And the number is constantly changing, but basically about in return for about $1 million of investment and the creation of 10 jobs, you can get a green card. And this is Vietnamese are now the third largest group receiving EB-5 visas after China and India, and just ahead of South Korea. And these flows have been transforming the aesthetic landscapes of many Asian American communities, from Queens, New York, to Bel Air, Texas, to Schaumburg, Illinois. And so I would argue, therefore, that in many ways it's no longer the traditional downtown Chinatowns, but rather these kinds of suburban ethnic neighborhoods where some of the most energetic Asian American community formations are now actually underway. Okay, so emergent business, transportation, and real estate development patterns in these ethno-burbs become gauges then to examine new forms of economic agency and the production of Asian American community landscapes. Yidang Chung in 2021 describes what she called refugee world-making as the labor of challenging, transforming, asserting, and carving out new ways of living. So refugee world-making is very much connected to this, this process of placemaking. And one salient example of how these agental worlding labors are connectively enacted and how they have affected the aesthetics of the landscapes they contribute to building is, I would argue, the automobile itself. So in the second half of this talk, I'd like to slow down a bit and ethnographically dwell on the role of the car itself as expressed in oral histories and cultural productions in order to demonstrate its contribution to processes of Vietnamese American displacemaking. This is a picture of a family leaving the Camp Pendleton refugee camp in 1975 in a car. And I'm just going to kind of let that picture sit there as I read through some of the ethnography now. So automobiles often provided immigrants their first and most accessible tail for agental mobility. And as I mentioned before, learning to use them was a concerted emphasis for refugee camp life skill training workshops. Indeed, automobiles are frequently recalled by Vietnamese American immigrants as one of their significant purchases or sometimes gifts. As one middle-aged Vietnamese man now living in Houston shared, quote, "We arrived in Pennsylvania. It was so cold and lonely there. After 6 months, we saved up enough money to buy a used Oldsmobile. We packed everyone into that car, and we went everywhere in it, from work to school, as well as on weekend family trips and picnics, sometimes even to Philadelphia or Northern Virginia for Asian groceries, but that was far." Members from one Methodist church in Buffalo, New York, that had sponsored a Cambodian refugee family in 1980, shared how they had raised contributions among their congregation to buy an old AMC Pacer for one of the families the church had sponsored. Within a year of getting that Pacer, they recalled, the family picked up and left and moved to Long Beach, California. Another Vietnamese American, recalling her original life in Bridgeport, Connecticut, before her family moved to Southern California, talked about how the isolation and living in the survival mode prevented her from thinking about her Vietnamese identity or history. She recalled, "I was living in a place where there was no reflection or inkling of Vietnamese culture or community. So basically, I created a new identity and tried to assimilate and adapt to this American identity." So that was a transition. For a long time, I didn't come to realize that my Vietnamese background and who I was very important. Eventually, her family saved enough, and with distant relatives in California as initial contacts, they packed up their belongings along with her and her brother and slowly drove across the country, visiting other Vietnamese contacts along the way, and at least on a couple of occasions in her memory, also slept together in the car at a highway rest stop. Cars were a tool of affordance, clearly, to not only move from places of first resettlement, where maintaining a sense of Vietnamese identity was difficult, but also to actively choose where to move to, and to establish more vibrant cultural communities within those places, whether Long Beach for many Cambodians or Garden Grove for many Vietnamese. Bolsa Avenue, the now busy Vietnamese boulevard that stretches through the heart of Little Saigon, California, that I showed you before, was largely undeveloped in 1975. As ethnic businesses began to expand along the boulevard, Vietnamese began to seek housing. And these included quickly assembled mobile home parks that were nearby. Recently, some of these trailer parks have been sites of Vietnamese community organizing and protest, as the gentrification of Southern California has led to increasing displacements of lower income and often aging communities. As in Houston's Asia towns, displacement, this time as gentrification, maps onto a longer history of domestic dispersion in the United States and displacement from Vietnam, including the double displacement of many 1954 north to south migrants, as well as the massive rural to urban exodus caused by South Vietnam's wartime domestic insecurity. As Vietnamese settle and resettle again, one witnesses eventual placemaking to the kinds of shopping malls, business districts, houses of worship, and even trailer parks that I've discussed. There is also the marking of Vietnamese suburban living through gardens. These are some gardens in the Vietnamese community in Versailles, which is a Vietnamese community just outside of New Orleans. And you can often see them marked by the kind of active gardening that they have. There's a recent book by Roy Vu that has explored in particular this phenomenon. But over time, even these markers may be transient, as now ghostly, once thriving Asian shopping centers or decaying, cheaply constructed housing are solely abandoned for newer and greener pastures. Again, many of the greener real estate pastures are afforded by the automobile, which in turn, despite their intrinsic mobility, ironically, sometimes become implicit stationary markers of place. Vietnamese Americans now count as one of the most suburban minority ethnic groups in the United States. In interviews with Vietnamese Americans in what might sometimes appear to be cookie cutter, lower income suburban neighborhoods, many explained how they could recognize the boundaries of their shared Vietnamese space by the kinds of automobiles that they drove and also parked. Over time, Vietnamese have expressed clear brand preferences, often directed to Japanese brands such as Honda and Toyota, although now Tesla is increasingly popular. Asian Americans purchase Japanese cars in the highest proportion of any ethnic group. And one middle-aged Vietnamese American man that I interviewed in suburban California shared how cars were a mark of identifying where the Asians resided in the neighborhood. He said, "See the Hondas and Toyotas on this block? That's because there's Vietnamese and other Asians living here. Over there on the other side, you see more Mexican and Black families, and they have more Dodges and Chevys." Asian cars can, of course, be marked as Vietnamese as well by the placement of cultural religious relics such as Buddhist or Catholic beads and other images hanging off the front mirror, veterans mementos, and things like that. Automobiles and their role in transitioning from refugee to Asian American life, including the initial secondary migration processes that have contributed to America's first Vietnamese American ethno-burbs, have been memorialized in numerous diasporic cultural productions. First-generation Vietnamese American author Jaden Op Nguyen, in his 1994 memoir about refugee flight from Vietnam and resettlement in New England, recalls after a few years living in a small Vermont town, buying an old Pontiac with the little savings that he had, packing up that car, and driving towards a new, unknown life in California. Over a generation later, the 2017 play Viet Cong by second-generation Vietnamese American playwright Queen Nguyen memorialized the experience of the secondary migration road trip. Journeying from Missouri to California, the main character explores changing relations to himself, his past, and his American future. In both, transportation indexes a sense of newfound refugee agency and imagining a new life that no longer depends on the burdensome original gift of freedom, as Mi Binh Nguyen terms the reciprocal gratitude that early Vietnamese refugees felt that they were compelled to demonstrate to their sponsors. In the archives of these military bases, you find a lot of evidence of churches talking about the assimilability of some of these refugee populations and the expected, return and gratitude that they were that was in many ways expected as these churches sponsored them in various places. As one woman now resettled in California recalls, after this escape experience and sponsorship by a Lutheran church in upstate New York, I always had to do everything that I could to be accepted by other people. Now, I also don't want to overemphasize this kind of car equals agency narrative that's coming out here. Many people I spoke with admittedly did not recall any grand country road trips, and I can see that these are the kinds of stories that certainly capture my attention ethnographically. A number of people that I interviewed, and this was sometimes also somewhat gendered, related matter-of-fact narratives about getting on an airplane from cities like Hartford, flying to Los Angeles, and getting picked up by family or friends there who would introduce them to the Vietnamese community and help them find new jobs and connections. In interviews, there's a lot of talk about how Vietnamese Americans moved to new places where there were opportunities to make money, how they were able to learn new skill sets and return to old ones as they started to have more control over the jobs they could access as English became a tool rather than a barrier. One woman originally resettled in Hartford, Connecticut, with little nostalgia now for the cold, the snow, and having to navigate the city buses, proudly shared with me after she moved to California, she was able to open up a Vietnamese restaurant in Orange County. This became very popular and allowed her to utilize her skills and share her culture and cuisine. Nonetheless, across interviews that I've been conducting, cars do come up time and again, even if in passing, as a critical tool to grab and connect the horns of navigating American life. And of course, for some who are stuck on the fringes of cities with limited access to transportation options, especially older people, the car can also become a symbol of a life inaccessible to many, catalyzing reflections on mobility injustices and exclusions. Even when one has a car, it can also be symbolic of the frustrating downward spiral of refugee lives that some experience as not going anywhere, whether success in America or returning to Vietnam. The second generation memoirist and author Lê Diem Thuy, for example, reflects on her refugee father and the debilitation he feels in his new American life, expressed in his relationship to his car. She describes, quote, late at night, unable to sleep after having moved from his bed to the couch to 4 dining room chairs lined up in a row, he drives down to the beach and spins the car wheels in the wet sand, daring himself to drive into the sea. At daybreak, he drives the car home, parks it at the edge of the driveway, lowers the seat, and falls asleep, exhausted. In the 1979 documentary film that was one of the early films that kind of captured these new waves of refugees that were coming to the United States, titled "The Fans of Jersey City," an unemployed young Vietnamese American man living in a household of 17 other fond relatives drives aimlessly around northern New Jersey in his Ford, with the skyline of Manhattan looming in the background, indexing a world that he is not a part of. As he steers the car through these rundown neighborhoods, he talks with a filmmaker about his desires for a different life, revealing his underemployed frustration, exacerbated by a lack of fluent language and educational opportunity. He nonetheless insists that anything that he's been able to achieve thus far in America has been by, quote, myself without any help from others. So I'd like to conclude now by reflecting on this idea of displacemaking and the generative potential for the application of the concept to rethink and analyze Vietnamese domestic and transnational community formations. Again, in 1975, refugee resettlement policymakers did everything they could to disperse Indochinese refugees around the country. Refugees in the 4 initial camps of Pendleton, Fort Chaffee, Indiantown Gap, and Eglin Air Force Base were not permitted to leave those camps until they were sponsored out by a family or a community group somewhere. Once families were resettled outside of the camps, social workers assigned to help them focused their efforts on cultivating economically stable nuclear family focused households and encouraged them to assimilate to mainstream American culture. In response, in some ways, Vietnamese did everything but. They insisted, even when their economic livelihoods were extremely marginal, on sending remittances to extended family back in the homeland. As soon as they could, they sponsored relatives to move and live with them for indefinite periods, spanning months and even years. As one man recalled, we moved to my uncle's apartment in California from the East Coast. The four of us, my family, we slept on the floor in the living room. It was good, except it wasn't great. It just, we shared all of that. We were known in the neighborhood as the refugee house. We used to all pile in the back of my uncle's car and go to the mall and walk around and look at things, but we couldn't buy anything. I think most refugees who came to America felt very depressed at first. Our expectations were too high because we didn't know what it was going to be like over there. What little resources early Vietnamese Americans were able to eventually accumulate, they typically pooled to buy plane or bus tickets or cars to move to other places with Asian populations, lured by stories of warm weather, jobs, marriage introductions, or more racial tolerance and acceptance. As they did so, these ethno-mobile agents worlded communities that referenced a lost homeland, as well as each other, dispersed over distant geographies in a large new country. Little Saigons dotted with yellow, red striped flags looked to Little Saigon, California, which ultimately remembered Saigon, South Vietnam, a capital and a nation state that no longer exist. Here's a picture of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam from the 1970s. And on the left here was kind of an interesting display at one of these Black April events in Little Saigon, California, where you see the imperial city of Hue juxtaposed against a bunch of South Vietnamese flags, kind of gesturing to this historical hypothetical that no longer exists. As Etienne Nguyen has argued, as part of a broader recent response to the critical refugee studies framework that has long argued for the necessity of a transnational lens when it comes to analyzing Vietnamese American subjectivities, one must also understand the socio-political formations that pre-existed in South Vietnam and how they implicitly shape refugee orientations and agential expressions when it comes to community organizing in the diaspora. Worlding, as Ananya Roy and Iwo Ong have described it, is characterized by interreferencing. In their analysis, emergent cities like Phnom Penh reference other global cities in the region like Singapore and model their developments accordingly. In the case of America's Little Saigons, Cambodia towns, and others, the original reference point is no longer a contemporaneous place. Collective meaning making in such spaces is therefore elusively oriented to a temporal past and tangentially to a hypothetical historical otherwise. And thus the centrality of the yellow South Vietnamese Republican flag and those Black April remembrances in such community formations. Ethno-mobile interreferencing conjures fragmented individual and collective memories and legacies of displacement, interspersed with a recognition of the significance and agency of mobility for escaping and shaping one's future life. Dreams of permanent return to the homeland deferred or abandoned, Vietnamese made their way to new communities around the country, strategically employing entrepreneurship and kinship networks to survive and sometimes get ahead. Economic success has varied, but mobility, if nothing else, has been a pathway for social reconnection and sometimes political expression. Examining the affordances and challenges of displaced making, whether in the details of entrepreneurship, real estate, or automobiles, provides an important perspective on the dynamic and multi-layered trajectory of Vietnamese American refugee and immigrant aspiration, adaptation, and community formation, in which pasts and futures are complexly entangled. The agencies that have been asserted over time are most often apparent in their material formations, and the model minority myth encourages us to interpret Asian American success on the basis of a US-centered economic status and social mobility. The global circulations of Vietnamese bodies over the last 50 years have resulted in a now global diaspora that are widely dispersed from their starting points. A collective sense of feeling displaced from a source of unrequited geographic and temporal origins has nonetheless become spectrally significant to the Vietnamese American community's ongoing mobilities and worlding orientations. Histories of displacemaking are integral to apprehending Vietnamese ethno-mobile infrastructures and the geographic, temporal, and mnemonic interreferencing processes that compare and conjoin them. The formations and continuing evolutions of Southeast Asian diaspora communities across the United States have undoubtedly turned out quite differently than the assimilationist resettlement models that were once envisioned by 1975 refugee policymakers. What I've gestured to today is the importance of soliciting the stories of how and why that came to be and are still becoming, not just once upon a time in Vietnam, but also over the last 50 years in America as well. The unmoored and unfolding horizon of refugee arrival clearly rarely conjures a stationary or tangible point of reference. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to our discussion.
Yes,
Does your research factor in Chinese Vietnamese? Because if you think about the success of the Vietnamese, so-called Vietnamese community, it includes a lot of Sino-Vietnamese. I mean, if you look at, for example, all the Vietnamese restaurants are actually run by Chinese. And so the Chinese Vietnamese, does that?
Yes. So my research.
Us, I mean, Little Saigon, many of the supermarkets and so on and so forth are actually run by Chinese.
Yeah, I mean, so that Buk Lop Tom Mall that I showed you was actually financed by Frank Zhao, who's a Chinese Vietnamese, and it's interesting in the archives to look at the different kinds of sponsoring groups that were trying to help Southeast Asians, and I'm talking not just about Vietnamese, but also in this, especially in this first wave, a lot of Cambodians. But Chinese Vietnamese were also significant among that. And so there were Chinese mutual aid associations that were also coming into these camps and specifically trying to help out sponsorship of some of the Chinese Vietnamese from there. So I think, structurally, I mean, my interest in going forward with this project is to kind of expand this out to look at all of the groups that were affected by these dispersion policies in 1975. I have a lot of data now on the Vietnamese, but the Cambodians, the Lao, the Hmong, the Chinese Vietnamese, these were all structurally affected by the same policy, and they all had in some ways similar responses. And so I've been collecting information from social workers that worked in some of these camps. Some of the Hmong, for example, actually reached out to Japanese American community leaders to try to understand their histories of agricultural farming, because that was something that they thought they could develop. And the Hmong response is different, right? You have people in like Fresno, California. But I think there's been a lot of focus sometimes on just kind of one ethnic group, but we have to kind of look at the entire Southeast Asian refugee population that was affected in 1975 structurally by these policies, and how the reactions overlapped in many ways.
Thank you. This is really fascinating. I have a couple questions, and I have to acknowledge they're really heavily filtered by teaching that I'm doing now in those themes. But I was wondering, thinking about the South Vietnamese flags and the kinds of attachments those demonstrate. And I'm sure that, in terms of contemporary US politics, the responses are heterogeneous. But for those who have those strong attachments, how does that influence, if you can, speak to this in your recent research, how they attach to, Republican and Democratic dynamics? So that's one question. And then the other question, and you can just dismiss it if you want, but the other question was recently watching Driving While Black. It's a PBS documentary, and then also it's a book. But one thing that's emphasized in that is the very long history of trying to control Black people's mobility.
Mhm.
But then with respect to the personal vehicle, how it's both this mode of, as you said, sort of agency and mobility and escape and avoidance, but also one that's always targeted by, forms of restriction, confinement, and violence as well. And so I'm curious if that there's also an analogous, narrative there vis-a-vis Vietnamese American automobile.
Yeah, thanks for those. So in general, I mean, among Asian Americans, Vietnamese Americans are one of the more conservative populations. And similar to Cuban Americans, there's a lot of anti-communist sentiment that becomes part of their political orientation. If you ever look at some of the kind of January 6th photos of the attack on the Capitol, there's a lot of yellow South Vietnamese flags in there as well. And so, estimates are about 50-50 Republican Democrat when it comes to the Vietnamese community, but that's, that percentage of Republican leaning Vietnamese is much higher. Yeah, that kind of anti-communist sentiment, I think, is also, it's about a racial formation that develops in the context of the United States as well. There's a, in a lot of the anti-communist protests, there's a kind of conjuring of trying to make connections to, a broader American society, which many Vietnamese Americans have felt excluded from. I see signs in some of these protests that I've gone to, talking about 50,000 dead American soldiers in the Vietnam War. Well, that number pales in comparison to the number of South Vietnamese who died. Why? But these signs are in English, and they're trying to make connections and create recognition there. So I think that kind of particular orientation to an American society and the politics of it is unique. And so what we see in the United States is different than what we might see in, for example, in Canada or France. In terms of the kind of limitations on mobility. That was interesting. I think a lot of these popular culture things that I talk about, that have been kind of exploring this kind of secondary migration process, they're fictionalized in many ways. The image of Queen Nguyen had on his play, Viet Gone, shows a family on a motorcycle. And that's a connection to motor mobility in Vietnam, but people weren't driving motorcycles in the secondary migration processes. But in the interviews that I've conducted, this road trip from one place to another, which oftentimes included the family, but sometimes just part of the family carrying, packing up things and being assigned to make that trip, was often eye-opening, because you see new landscapes, especially as you drive out west, but then, a little bit fearful of venturing too far off the road, right? They stopped at familiar places, where they had family and friends and could stay over at their houses. But when they didn't have those spaces, they stayed in the rest stops, right? And slept together there. There was a bit of uncertainty about, about feeling visible and vulnerable in these in-between spaces. But certainly, I've also talked to sponsors, right, of some of these groups, and sometimes there's a bit of a resentment that they did all this work to kind of help out these Southeast Asian families, and including buying them a car, and then that car being the very thing that made them leave, but not really kind of understanding some of the challenges that they were facing socially and adapting to a new place. And that's really interesting in the archives, because you see there was a lot of emphasis on kind of religious organizations coming in to play a sponsorship role. And there was a lot of discussions by some of these church groups about, Catholics might be more assimilable, but Buddhists were kind of they were kind of too culturally unfamiliar, and so whether they could be integrated or not was actually a debate that emerges in some of these documents.
Thanks, Ivan. Very rarely do I hear Harrisburg, Pennsylvania brought up in.
Is that where you're from?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And my first memory of anything having to do with Southeast Asia is my church sponsoring a Vietnamese refugee community. In my youth group, I was like 11. So this is after the first wave. I remember like buying the clothes, the canned food. And I remember the lousy summer jobs that I had. That were summer jobs for me, but they were permanent jobs for many of the community that I was working with. So much of my own thinking of Southeast Asia comes with that experience. So my question is about what happens to places like Harrisburg after that secondary migration internally. And I'm struck by how the stories you tell of going to California, going to Texas, going to the sunbelt from the heartland these are timeless, not particularly Southeast Asian coded themes. And my in-laws, for example, are totally consumed by their own migration history from New York to Los Angeles in the 70s. And the deli that we go to for every time we get out there is like this representation of what seems to be like an analogous process. And I wonder if this is something that the communities that you're working with reflect on also. Like, it's not just these people saying these things about the desire to get out of Missouri or Harrisburg. And likewise, the desire to get out of Southern California and out to Texas. So I wonder if this is something that people reflect on, just the very Americanness, the quotidian Americanness of this practice.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting, because oftentimes that story that I really want to, kind of dig out, right, in these interviews of that process of moving from point A to point B, that secondary migration process, and and the road trip itself. If they have those stories, like people are like, well, why do you care? And then the car, right, as a tool of agency and mobility. Well, I mean, oftentimes people have very frustrated memories of their first car, because they bought these. People hate American cars because there were a lot of American cars at the time, and they bought old used ones, right? And they have to remember fixing them all the time. The fact that oil is always leaking out of the that Ford Pinto, and there's a whole kind of and if you go to these little Saigons, there's like, Vietnamese auto repair shops, right? Where, a lot of kind of fixing these things became part of the skill set, right? Of being able to economically establish yourselves. But yeah, I mean, when I went to these military bases to look at the archives, and Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, it's actually, you should go back because it's only a lot of the military bases has been kind of turned over, and they're trying to turn it into like a shopping area now. So there's actually a brew pub on site. You can get a beer and walk around some of the old refugee housing. But every time I would spend my day in the archives, and then I would ask the archivist, well, where can I get some Vietnamese food around here? And there's significant communities that still exist in these areas because one of the things that was very frustrating to Gerald Ford when he was promoting the bringing in refugees was that Americans just didn't want it, right? So there was a lot of the photos that were taken in these camps were in part a PR thing, right, to kind of show that Americans were goodwill, they were helping out these helpless refugees, and the areas around those camps became more hyper aware of these processes, and so a lot of community groups, churches in particular, around these areas would sponsor people out. And so in any of these places, whether in Arkansas or Pennsylvania, there are I can always find a Vietnamese restaurant, right? And there's a small community that still exists. But on the other hand, there's this out migration, and how that differs from other ethnic groups and their stories of secondary migration is that people that in the interviews that I've done, right, there's a movement towards ethno-burbs, right? There's a movement towards, why are we moving to California? Because we know there's Asian people there. We know that there's, it's not just moving to a place with warmer weather, right? But it's a place where you can feel comfortable, you can feel visible, a place that you feel that you can you can start to do placemaking, right? And these in-between spaces are not part of that. So, those are I was like, where are the stories of stopping at, Zion National Park and and looking at those things? Nobody did that. Later on that happens, but so it's interesting in this process of kind of moving from point A to point B. Number one, people don't seem to necessarily remember the process that much, and so I had to kind of uncover that in interviews. But secondly, where they stopped along the way was quite limited to either connecting to friends and family that they knew, or staying on the rest stop, and sleeping in the car. But there wasn't a whole lot of kind of exploration of the local diner along the way. So that's that kind of racialized element, I think, is different than other domestic migration stories.
Hi, thanks for your talk, Ivan. So my first question is, between the newer immigrants from contemporary Vietnam when they visit ethno-burbs and maybe see the red and yellow flags. My second question is, did you find that when the refugees first came over and were building the ethno-burbs, did they meet with any NIMBYism, whether from local white communities around them, pushing back?
Did they meet with racism? Is it?
Not in my backyard.
Oh, yeah, not in my backyard, yeah.
Some of this kind of pushbacks in terms of where they're building their ethno-burbs or where they're even choosing to build the ethno-burbs.
So the first part was tension between newer and older, and secondly, not in my backyard considerations. Yeah, so one of the ways which the federal government tried to encourage refugee resettlement was to kind of contact local officials, right, state governors, city mayors, and try to make the case that this was that this was a worthwhile thing, that there were funds to help support this, right? But again, part of the reason why you have this rich documentation of it is because PR was part of it, right? Because a lot of communities just really did not want those Vietnamese in their backyard, right? They didn't differentiate between South Vietnamese and Communist Vietnamese, right? They were all Vietnamese that they had been fighting and were tired of, right? They didn't want that at all. And the most passionate advocates for resettlement would still promise, right, that we're not going to concentrate any group in any one place, right? Even when they recognized that there was the importance for having, kinship networks in order to survive. And New Orleans, for example, the Archdiocese of New Orleans was one of the first places that said we're going to, mass sponsor a group of 50. I can't remember the number exactly, but to recognizing that you needed these networks in order to survive. But oftentimes that was, in a context of public opinion that was really against refugee resettlement. When it comes to the kind of conflicts between newer and older immigrants, right? And here you have kind of refugee histories and newer immigrants. That's one of the things I referenced, is that in places like Little Saigon, that community in particular was really resettled by elites from the former Saigon regime, right? Government and military elites. That republicanism, the anti-communism, is very central to community identity and becomes inherited. It's not just something that goes away with time, but it becomes inherited. You see, Vietnamese Boy Scouts, wearing, young kids wearing the South Vietnamese flag on their uniforms. And so that kind of political element of identity becomes really important. And Houston was interesting in some ways because, even though Houston's in a red state, a lot of newer Vietnamese who felt oppressed by that kind of diasporic political sentiment felt freer in Houston. At least that's what people were expressing, right? They could kind of disappear into the community, so I mentioned An Nguyen, who's estimated that there's actually 10,000 kind of North Vietnamese immigrants that live in the Houston area. And, what are their stories? How are these stories being told? And increasingly, there's kind of resentment that this collective history narrative focuses entirely on 1975. And I'll tell you, just as a kind of side here, the kind of connection between my original project on migration and remittances and this project, in between that, I did a project on automobiles in Southeast Asia. So completely different. I looked at the ASEAN free trade area and how that was kind of contributing to different kinds of car consumptions and production processes. And one of the things that was part of that project was looking at a new car company called VinFast. This is a Vietnamese car that's been produced only in the last 5 years or so. And they are now selling them in the United States. This is a showroom in California. And so when I was in Vietnam, I spent time, talking to drivers. I went to the VinFast factory, but the company connected me to some of the owners in the United States so that I could interview them, right? And that became really interesting to me because, this car, oftentimes, newer Vietnamese immigrants who were quite proud and nationalistic about this car, they would own one of these, but they worked in Little Saigon. And so when they drive into Little Saigon, they don't want to drive this car because of the connection of this company, which is has a lot of close connections with the government. And so they had to kind of leave that car at home and drive in a different car into the office. Otherwise, they would stand out as newer immigrants. And so that was interesting.
I was curious if you have any experiences with the Myanmar refugee communities, and if you do, like how you'd compare your observations with them to other Southeast Asian refugee communities.
So, I mean, I do like actually, going way back to my MA work and around 2000, 2001. I was doing a MA in International Affairs at the time, and I interviewed refugees from Burma that were living in Thailand to look at kind of scholarship programs that were happening at the time. And that's actually when I became an anthropologist, because I went to Thailand. I interviewed all these different groups. I'm like, I don't know anything about Burma and Thailand. Like, I need to have a deeper understanding of place, right? And so that's why I decided to apply to Cornell and with the area studies and anthropology. But because of that experience, I've always been quite interested in the Burmese situation, the Burmese refugee populations. And I'm currently director of the Southeast Asia Center at Northern Illinois University. It's the Title VI Center, just like Cornell. But as part of that, we actually have a separate Center for Burma Studies. And we have a lot of Burmese students who are have come here for study, and many can't go back now. And so I've been following that quite a bit. We actually have a Karen refugee project at our center, which looks at some of the groups in the area. Burmese, refugees are interesting in that, especially some of the groups that have been sponsored to the United States, including the Karen, are highly Christian. And in the Chicago area, there's a kind of there's a conservative, quite a rather conservative suburb of Chicago called Wheaton, where you actually is the place where you can find some Burmese food because of that history of sponsorship. And so, that kind of Christian narrative and how it gets connected to kind of refugee identity is quite interesting, because there are some, some Buddhist Karen that, feel like they're not part of the community visibility because they're minorities in that group. But also how, these refugees then get kind of pulled into larger Asian American populations. I've been following, Burmese groups all around the country, including, here in Ithaca, including in Hartford, Connecticut. You go into Whole Foods in Hartford, the Burmese are all running the sushi, part of the of the store. As far as I know, there's not a lot of sushi in Burma, but they're visibly Asian, right? And so how that becomes part of this kind of economic ethnic niching is quite interesting.
Hero and Brian, you can ask the questions first, and then Ivan can answer together because of the time.
Sure.
Can you comment on how migrants interact with others on the maybe a stronger connection when you see migrants from Thailand, Indonesia, or are they showing a difference when they see doesn't matter if Indonesians, Indonesia, Malaysia, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Are they showing like a stronger connection to this because they belong to the same region? Because we tend to lump Southeast Asia into one group.
Yeah.
There's practically as well.
Should I take both questions and then answer again?
Actually, my question was pretty much the same. I was going to ask you to provide more texture on interethnic Southeast Asian sort of flows and interactions. I'm thinking, I'm also thinking of your use of ethno-burbs and the purchase of thinking about ethno-burbs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Within both the moment, but also in thinking about like Southern California, where it's like you go to Westminster for Vietnamese, right? You go to Westminster as a California person instead of Long Beach as a California, as a Californian, right? I'm thinking about things like the ethnic studies model curriculums that came out of California. I worked on the Cambodian American Studies model curriculum, but that coming out of a Vietnamese state representative who was thinking about starting a Vietnamese American Studies curriculum, and then adds on Hmong and Cambodian genocide was the topic.
Yeah.
Because of her colleagues, and then Cambodians coming on saying, or Cambodian communities in Long Beach saying, why were we just added, sort of piecemeal to this? Why is it Cambodian genocide, right? Like, so, like within this sort of concatenation of just like, oh, you have a little Saigon, why don't we have a little, why don't we have a Cambodian town or things like that, right? So
yeah,
that texture.
Yeah, so I mean that kind of spectrality of like different communities and how it leads to visibility, and I think is important. One becomes an Asian American in America, right? First generation immigrants and refugees often don't kind of identify with that Asian American term, but second generation certainly very widespread. And why? Because your identity is contingent, right? So in America, people are identifying them as Asian American, and for that reason, Vietnamese have often felt comfortable being around other Asians, right? Whether Southeast Asians or East Asians or South Asians, that those are kind of artificial divides. To the extent that there's like a Southeast Asian identity, I mean, there are certain things politically in Southeast Asia, like ASEAN or SEA Games, that kind of contribute to that, right? But the proximity of many of these Vietnamese communities are often right next to Korean or Chinese communities, right? And and certainly in California, where I worked, I mean, Little Koreatown and Little Saigon are next to each other. There's a lot of intermarriages there, and in that process, a lot of kind of discovery of connections and commonalities, but then also recognizing differences. And in that process of realizing that there are differences that need to be highlighted, pushing for community groups that that establish museums that tell the histories of a particular group. In Chicago, we work closely in my center with a Cambodian Heritage Museum, and that's been really important because it tells the story of Cambodian migration to the U.S., but also the genocide there. And a lot of Cambodian Americans from around the country come there, and that becomes a space for them to kind of reflect on their own family histories that may or may not have been told, right? I was just in California doing research over the winter break, and now there's a Vietnamese Heritage Museum there that features a boat that was actually used by refugees and picked up by a Japanese freighter back in the 1970s, and somehow it ended up in France, and they actually raised money and transported it all the way to California. But in that process, they've created a wonderful display of all the the remnants from the re-education camps in Vietnam, just the the kind of metal boxes that people packed in order to come here. So, telling that story, has become increasingly important. And places like Illinois, we have the Teach Act now, and this is true in other states as well, right? There's been recent legislation that has required the teaching of Asian American history, right, which starts with refugees, in most parts with Asia, right? And so, as universities, we have a responsibility to, help K through 12 teachers, kind of understand that, because mandating the legislation doesn't mean that you have the resources. And that's one thing that Title VI, resource centers have been very useful for developing materials. Even when I was here at Cornell, I think, Thamara, you sent me out to a school and I taught, a small segment on the Vietnam War and post 1975 refugees. So, yeah, I think that whole kind of production of an Asian American kind of collective identity, but then as that develops, also different groups wanting to kind of assert their own individual histories is something that has been moving very rapidly over the last generation. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming. It's really nice to talk to you.